All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today and this morning, and also thank you for coming out for lunch and our keynote address. This is my second symposium, and like last year, I think we've all been enriched and learned a lot from the morning's program and are looking forward to our keynote address. And with that, it's my pleasure to reintroduce, I guess, David Robbins. It's always awkward introducing someone that everyone knows. But I'm thrilled that he's able to provide this address. I'm also so thankful for his words this morning. I learned a great deal. As I think you all know, he's co-founder of Hill and Robbins PC and a specialist in the fields of both water and environmental law. He's a former U.S. Army captain and Colorado Deputy Attorney General. He has many accolades to his name. He presided over the Colorado Water Conservation Board and the Colorado River Salinity Control Forum. He was the counsel of record for the state of Colorado in the U.S. Supreme Court case, Kansas versus Colorado. And from his remarks this morning, it sounds like he was out in D.C. to hear the oral arguments before the Supreme Court on our latest case. And he was also named Colorado Water Leader of the Year in 2012. As I know, his name is familiar to most, if not all of you. He's been a fixture in the Valley's advocacy efforts around water for more than 3 decades, during which time he led the efforts to resist the water exportation scheme developed by the AWDI. And I think we all appreciate his efforts in that regard. As part of that effort, he drafted the initial legislation that led eventually to the congressional redesignation of the Great Sand Dunes National Monument to the Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve in 2004. He continues to be the counsel of record for the Rio Grande Water Conservation District. Please join me in welcoming David.
Hello, everyone, again. I have a couple of thoughts that I'd like to share first. And the first is, I'd like to apologize to Nathan and Aaron for running on too long and leaving them with no time. They are wonderful water leaders here in the Valley in their own right. I got wound up and didn't get myself stopped in time. So apologies, friends. The other thing that I want you all to think about is that I'm an advocate. My job is to understand from the Rio Grande Water Conservation District Board what they believe to be the appropriate position that their agency on behalf of the Valley should take in water matters. And I take that position, and then I form arguments that I hope are persuasive. But more importantly, I try to think through how to allow the trier of fact, being the water judge who sits in Division 3 and is responsible for the development of water law in this division, and in figuring out how to find a way through all of the competing claims. You are all very fortunate today to have three, not the most recent, Judge Gonzalez is not here, I understand, but the 3 water judges who have guided how water resources have been handled in this valley for about 50 years. And I want you all to recognize Judge Bob Ogburn, Judge John Keenhold and Judge Patty Swift for their contributions. They have, over those 50 years, put up with my shenanigans, straightened me out when I was completely off base, and written some of the most thoughtful, careful, thorough decisions that have been written during that time by any water judges anywhere in the state. So please appreciate what you have here today. And if you have not said hello to them, I hope you will. Okay, we talked earlier today about a little bit about the lawsuit between Texas and New Mexico. Now we need to talk a little bit about the issue of water export. And before we talk about that, let's think about the San Luis Valley. And let's think about science and the level of science that we currently enjoy versus what Judge Ogburn, for example, had to deal with 50 years ago. Before I go on that, I have to tell you one other thing. I was representing the state of Colorado when there were no in-stream flow water rights legally available in the state. And I was assigned as a very young lawyer the job of defending or advancing the constitutionality of the in-stream flow statute. And the water judges in Water Division 5, which was the venue for our fight, all recused themselves. And the Supreme Court appointed the Honorable Robert Ogburn as the trial judge for the in-stream flow case. And establishing once again his genius as a jurist, he was able to see through the objections of the more traditional water users, and in fact wrote an opinion that allowed the Supreme Court to find that the in-stream flow statute was in fact constitutional. And many people in generations after Bob's and mine have taken for granted that Colorado can have protections for in-stream flows. And I guarantee you that prior to 1972, it did not exist. So I want to recognize the good judge on that behalf as well. And I love him more when he rules in favor of me instead of against me, but or I used to. Okay. Let's talk about the valley just a minute, right? It's this great big bowl, right? It's a rift valley. It's part of the Rio Grande Rift. It's where you wouldn't have earthquakes in San Francisco without things like the San Luis Valley, right? Because when plates slide, that means that they're pulling a huge pile of rocks and dirt behind them from somewhere else. And so across the continental United States, you have to have rifts if you're going to have earthquakes. And this is a rift valley. It runs from up in Wyoming into Old Mexico. As a result, the basement rocks under our valley, under where we are now, are very deep in the ground, and in one place maybe 16,000 feet below the surface. They're filled with all different kinds of sediment. And as we all know, water without an impermeable barrier reacts to gravity just like everything else. And so water will sink to the lowest permeable level that is not filled with water or some other fluid. And beginning in the 60s at least, people began to look at this huge basin filled with rocks and gravel and sand and clay and say, oh my God, there must be a lot of water there. There was a genius, in my humble opinion, a USGS employee named Phil Emery, who in the 1960s and early 1970s did an extensive, sophisticated study of the San Luis Valley. And at one point announced that he thought there were 3 billion acre feet of water available in the San Luis Valley. Now, this was prior to the current level of understanding based on core drilling and based upon highly sophisticated computer models. This was at a time, Phil Emery's model of the San Luis Valley consisted of 10 or 12 sheets, 8 by 10 sheets of plywood lined up. And on that plywood, he had resistors and capacitors, and behind it, he had all sorts of wires. And that was how he represented the movement of groundwater through all of the soil. And if he found that his resistance was too high, he had to run around behind the thing with a pair of snips and a soldering iron and take a resistor out and put in one that's a little bit more resistive. Well, so Phil kind of led the parade with his musings. In a subsequent trial before one of our esteemed judges, Phil took the stand and said, "For Lord's sake, all I did was take the length of the valley by the width of the valley by the potential depth of the sediments that I thought might be productive by a general storativity number, and I just did it on the back of a napkin, and that's what it comes up to." He said, "I didn't consider water quality. I didn't consider barriers to water movement from faults or from other things. That's just a calculation. You know, come on. You know, can't I have a sense of humor?" And so, but we were off. We'd already pushed the sled over the rim and we were headed down the course. And all of the people at least in North America, who believed that there was a profit to be made by stripping the earth of fresh water and selling it to the highest bidder, their ears perked up. The first entity that made a serious run at the valley was San Marco Pipeline. San Marco Pipeline wanted to take water off the Castilla Plain. In terms of impact to the valley, that was probably the most benign of all of the thoughts about speculating on the San Luis Valley's water, because there is quite a bit of groundwater moving from Colorado to New Mexico on the Castilla Plain. Now, if they'd been successful with the project, I can almost assure you we would have been in the U.S. Supreme Court, New Mexico versus Colorado, because they would have been picking off water that's moving down into the Sunshine Valley, but that's neither here nor there. The idea behind San Marco was we'll pump fresh water over the mountain to Walsenburg. At Walsenburg, we will have coal trains coming down from Wyoming, and we will pulverize the coal, mix it with water, and put it into a pipeline and pump it to Houston. And that way we won't have environmental problems with all these coal trains. Ultimately, they never really had a trial. The economics of slurried coal became apparent and they backed down. Slurried coal isn't a very good source of power because the BTUs, even if it's good coal, are low, because the first thing you have to do when you burn the coal is evaporate the water, which takes almost all of the energy that the coal would have been used to provide the steam to make the power. So that's neither here nor there. All right. Welcome to the crevices of my mind. All right. That's the 70s. In 1985, a group called American Water Development, Inc. surfaced It was sponsored by a man named Maurice Strong. He had purchased a controlling interest in the Baca Ranch from its previous owner, which was Arizona Land and Cattle. And Arizona Land and Cattle ran it as a cattle ranch. Maurice was an interesting guy, Canadian. He would work in the energy industry, replenish his stock of funds, and then he would, in doing so, blacken his name to environmentalists. And then he would step back from those investments, and the Canadian government, if it was the appropriate party, would appoint him to the UN as a minister from Canada on the environment. And once he'd gotten his reputation shined up again, he'd do another speculation. So Maurice got a hold of the grant. He got convinced that there was this huge lake of water there. He got a lot of people, former Governor Richard Lamb being one of them, to believe that he could produce this water without any harm to the environment and provide a whole new supply of water to the Metropolitan Front Range. Well, and off we went. The swords came out. There were some really fine lawyers representing all of you. I had the pleasure of being, I guess, the spokesperson counsel, if you want to call it that. I certainly wouldn't ever pretend I was lead counsel, because that would diminish the contributions of all of the other attorneys. So Mr. Strong's lawyers said, listen, there's all of this water. There's 2 or 3 billion acre feet, more than Lake Michigan, all good water. Now, that was, of course, a lie, because we all know that depending on the area of the San Luis Valley or the depth that you're drilling, the water is skunk, right? I mean, if you're including the water that sits under the Blanca habitat out there, that's 30,000 parts per million, for God's sake. You can't do anything with that. So all of that aside, they alleged that 3 things. Either the water belonged to them and they could do what they wanted with it because it was underneath a Spanish or Mexican land grant. And under Spanish and Mexican law, the owner of the overlying surface had some extra right to use the water below the property as well as the water flowing on the property. They clearly had not done their historical research. Secondly, they said the water's all non-tributary. It is not going to affect any surface streams. And then finally, they said it's tributary, but there's so much that it really doesn't matter. And we should be able to make our appropriation of 200,000 acre feet a year without a problem. And we went through lots of discovery, and Judge Ogburn correctly ruled, in my opinion, that in fact, this was not a Spanish land grant, as I described to you this morning. It was in fact simply common public land that had been patented to the Baca heirs in settlement of the contest over the land grant in New Mexico at the site of the city of Las Vegas. So out that one went. Ultimately, the Supreme Court confirmed the legal reasoning that Judge Ogburn had used, and we haven't had to talk about Spanish and Mexican law as it relates to the Baca grant since. Now, I do want to, while I have the chance, Castilla County is a land grant. It is a confirmed land grant, okay? That's why there's no federal land in Castilla County. And that was the Sangre de Cristo grant. The furthest north land grant that I'm aware of is the Hermosillo grant, which is in Pueblo County. I'll wander off. I'm sorry, but I'll wander off. The Hermosia grant, no one has ever realized until my client acquired it, that it was in fact the Hermosia grant, because since the Civil War, which was contiguous with the Mexican-American War by a few years, it was always called the Butler Ranch, because the bloody Butler, or whatever his name was, he was a general from New Jersey, I think, and was a notorious Union Civil War campaigner. He arranged, as part of his departure from service, the conveyance of the Hermosia grant to the Butler family, and for 150 years it was called the Butler Ranch. It is in fact a land grant. Okay. The non-tributary claim was able to be, the tributary claim was not well-founded, and on the eve of trial, I may have this confused, Judge Ogburn, so you straighten me out, but what on the eve of trial, they withdrew their claim for that the water was tributary and relied on the fact that they could show it was non-tributary. We had a 10 or 12-week trial, and they failed miserably in establishing that claim, because they had caused the people of this valley several $1 million in engineering and legal expenses. Judge Ogburn entered an order requiring them to pay not only the engineering fees, but the legal fees that the valley suffered in defending against a claim, which ultimately they withdrew at the last minute, which was totally appropriate, and I think stands a good monument to all who wish to come after the valley, that they damn well better have their facts in order. Ultimately, the AWDI application was dismissed, and the Supreme Court sustained that dismissal. Then we had sort of a parade of dogs and cats. But the three that stand out the most are Cabeza de Vaca, Stockman's Water, and Sustainable Water Resources. They all have been basically the same claims. There's lots of water here. Why can't we just have a little bit of it? They've altered what they were asking for from 200 down to 150, down to 100, bounced around. But none of the three, Cabeza de Vaca was the one owned by Farallon, and it was because of Farallon's recognition that their basic claim was untenable that we were able to acquire the Baca Ranch in the name of the Nature Conservancy, which was subsequently then paid back by the Congress so that we could establish the Great Sand Dunes National Park. So there were good things that flowed out of this effort to strip the valley of whatever water resources could be proven to somehow be available. But all of these did not go to trial, primarily because in some, for example, they spent their time in their litigation efforts in attempting to defeat rules and regulations being promulgated by the state of Colorado to better control how people approached and viewed the groundwater systems of the San Luis Valley. And in particular, a set of rules that basically formalized the long-held judicial position that the valley was over-appropriated, including its aquifers. And as a result, the rules said if you pump water out of the ground under a new appropriation from the confined aquifer, you have to put that same amount of water back into the ground at that location, or you will be disrupting the way the water resources of the confined aquifer are, how they're working. So with the Supreme Court's support of Judge Keenholz's ruling, that in fact the rules were appropriate, we moved on to the next phase. The good things, at least from my perspective, that have come out of all of this turmoil and tussle are we took first and I want everyone to be clear, what was done by the Rio Grande Water Conservation District Board and by the people of this valley was thoughtful. The objective was clear. They understood what they were doing at each step, your leaders. They didn't do it just for the hell of it. The National Monument, let's use that as an example. The sand dunes were protected, but because of the language in the sand dunes formation documents under the Antiquities Act, the only water features that were important to the dune mass itself were Sand and Mackinac Creek. And we all know that Sand and Mackinac Creek every spring cycle all the sand that blew east. They pick it up and they haul it around to the west, which is why the dunes are so big. And instead of migrating over the pass into the Wet Mountain Valley, they stay right there. So we immediately, my clients and I contacted the Justice Department and said, let's get you a reserve water right on Sand and Mackinac Creek, which we did. So there is a reserve water right that protects the flows, the variable flows that you all enjoy in the spring on Sand and Mackinac Creek. But that didn't help us with the groundwater. And so the fundamental underlying reason that you have a national park is not because the Chamber of Commerce said, wouldn't it be great if it was a national park? That isn't what happened. The Rio Grande Water Conservation District said, we need a mechanism to have Congress reserve more water. That's what we want. If Congress makes a reservation, then we can get the water court to enter a decree that will protect the priority and quantity of that reservation. And so we prepared a draft bill to create a national park. It took us a few years. It even went so far as to require a complete amendatory process to create the preserve at the head of Sand Creek. Why? Because you can't hunt in a national park, and that's some of the greatest sheep hunting in the state. And the sheep hunters were damned if we were going to turn that into a park. So that's why you have a preserve. And preserves have been used by the park system before so that they can have their park and then the land around it can be called a preserve where they can allow hunting. So we got the park. Took some time, but our political leadership was valiant. The Forest Service, everywhere in the state of Colorado, water users just like you spend all their time fighting the Forest Service over reserve rights. By God, they're not going to do this, they're not going to do that. Your leadership back in the 1990s said, wait a minute, let's look at a map. Here's the San Luis Valley on the valley floor where all of our agriculture occurs, where all of our diversions occur. And all around us is national forest. Let's do two things. Let's accept the Forest Service's claim for a reserved water right on the stream flows on the forest, not fight them, but work with them. And let's look at wilderness areas. Why? to make absolutely certain that the entire horseshoe around the valley cannot be used by enterprises seeking to move water in any direction out of the valley, unless they have to go through a wilderness area or disrupt an in-stream flow held by the federal government for those streams. What's the genius? Where's the water going? It's going down to the San Luis Valley floor where all of you can use it. There's no impact on you at all that the Forest Service says to someone, you can't build a dam there. You can't build a bridge there. Because what's happening is that reservoir that is the big round circle of mountains around you is in fact preserved forever. And we gave them effectively all the water they wanted in those streams. The only thing we took back was they had to recognize in perpetuity every water right and reservoir on the forest and not impose new or additional terms and conditions on it. So that if you have a ditch on the forest, they can't come in and cause you to have to bypass beyond what your decree or even into your decree. So there was another way that we could make life more interesting from those who would like to attack the San Luis Valley and take its water. So I guess the final thing, I mentioned that we have a Rio Grande natural area between here and New Mexico. That doesn't really have much to do with export, in truth. That is specifically designed to limit the ability of the federal government to influence or impact the diversion of private water rights upstream. And I won't talk about that today. So in the early 1990s, we prevailed on Senator Tim Wirth at that time to introduce an amendment, which is still law today, which said that no federal agency in any branch of government may issue any permit, license, permission, contract, I can't think of all of the words, to take water out of the San Luis Valley in any direction, unless after study of the environmental consequences, the Colorado Water Conservation Board in conjunction with the federal agencies determined that there would be no impact whatsoever on the National Monument National Park, Closed Basin Project, the wildlife refuges, or any other federal interest in the valley. We have not tested the applicability of that statutory prohibition, but we certainly will if someone wants to test it. We will defend it vigorously. It has a good legislative history. So that's where we were until a bunch of years ago. I apologize, but because of COVID, I've lost how I keep track of time for about 3 years or so. I'm always reticent to say it was 5 years ago or 8 years ago or whatever. Renewable Water Resources, which is mostly the same people, certainly the same engineer as Sustainable Water Resources earlier, made a proposal that it needed to get 22,000 acre feet in perpetuity from the aquifers of the San Luis Valley. It isn't any different than any of the other claims. It doesn't have any different consequence. Smaller potentially, but certainly it has the same impact on all of you. And that is, as you all know, we are struggling with sustainability. Your community writ large is using more water than Mother Nature or the weatherman is giving you on average each year. You continue to take more out than gets put in. Now, there are areas in the valley who have reversed that trend. There are areas in the valley that are struggling to reverse the trend. And ideally, in the next few years, we will reverse that trend and begin to actually re-establish the safe aquifer levels. Now, this, to my mind, folks, some of you are spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars to pump an acre foot of water, right? Because you're trying everything in your playbook to reduce how much consumption is occurring in this valley. You can't bring in more water because it only comes from snow, and we don't seem to be having much luck with that. And the amount that goes out can only go out in three ways. One, we're mandated by the compact to deliver water to New Mexico, and we have faithfully met that obligation since 1968. And secondly, it evaporates off Mother Nature, right? One of the biggest exports out of the valley is what gets evaporated and burned off through our natural vegetation. And the final way it goes out is through crops. So the only thing we can really control, we acknowledge it, to get the system back in balance is to reduce the amount of irrigation that's occurring. Doing that has adverse consequences to your community. You may not see them all, but if a quarter section of alfalfa goes out and goes back to native vegetation, what happens? Well, number one, it's no longer a productive piece of farm ground. Number two, most importantly, on the county rolls, it goes from irrigated to waste or dry land. And what happens then to the taxes that that quarter section helps support? Not just for the county government, not just for the road graders, not just for the Rio Grande Water Conservation District, but for the school district and the cemetery district and every other district you all have put together that you require to have a financial ability to produce enough money to run things around here the way you want them. So you're self-inflicting a reduction in the amount of taxes. That's admirable. It's appropriate. It's what we have to do. How in the world can anyone make an argument to a water court or any other court that somehow, in the face of this struggle and sacrifice by the people of this valley, is there 22,000 acre feet a year that can just suddenly appear and be pumped out each and every year? You are all familiar with irrigation. When it's a dry year, do you irrigate with 400,000 acre feet, let's say? No. You cut it, half of the population runs without water for most of the year. You only get to divert 200 or something. So how is there going to be a guaranteed 22,000? How can we morally justify allowing people on the front range to buy from a speculator 22,000 acre feet of water to allow their community to succeed, or worse, to build more houses where that 22,000 has to be consistently delivered because you got people who have to flush the toilets? It's an obscenity. All right? That's quite frankly what it is. It's greed, and that's all that's behind it. There's no altruism. There's no goodwill. This is about finding a way to get water out from under you and sell it to the highest bidder. That's what this is all about. And to the extent any of you are interested in participating or supporting that sucker's game, go at it. But the people of this valley for the past 30 or 40 years that I've represented you all have been willing to fight and resist, because you don't have anything else in this valley except the integration of your water resources and your economy, your lifestyle, and your environment. You pull water out from under the valley, you have to put it back as much as you take out, because if you don't, you get back into a reducing water table. What's the biggest sacrifice that you make? You begin to pay more to pump for everyone who's left, but more importantly, all of the vegetation that many of you have grown up with starts to die, right? Because it depends on water table. You can't, find highest and best use. We should pump it to the metropolitan area. No, that's not what we should be doing. We should be trying to improve and protect the water supply for the citizens of this valley, the water supply for your environment, for your lifestyles. This shouldn't become a sacrifice zone. And I'm going to tell you just a short story. Some of you have heard this before, but in the 1920s, the Los Angeles Water and Power Authority went into the Owens Valley, not dissimilar from this valley. Mount Whitney sits, the highest point in the lower 48, sits right up above the Owens Valley. It was a prolific farming valley. They came in and started to buy water using an undisclosed principle, buying farms, not just the water, but the farms. And then one day they announced that they were building an aqueduct 200 miles to LA, and they were going to take the water that they now owned to LA, and they did. But that's not where it stopped. And despite what their prior promises were, they then proceeded to buy effectively 100% of all of the agriculture in the Owens Valley. And the only thing the people in that valley have today is the ability to support people who want to climb Mount Whitney or walk in the John Muir Wilderness or go rock climbing or go skiing at Mammoth, but they don't have any agriculture. Owens Lake, which was a lake until the 30s, is now one of the largest sources of toxic dust pollution in the country. So I don't care what the proponents of renewable water resources say of we only want 22. I've always worn cowboy boots. So put it in that category. Once there is a pipeline in place, it will be used to its fullest capacity. And you just have to assume that. The proponents of RWR may be totally honest in their statement that this is all we want, right? But they can't say, and I pray won't say, that we can control everybody else in the Denver Metropolitan Front Range. You have to listen carefully. Nobody's telling you a fib. They're saying all we want is 22,000 acre feet a year. They're not saying, and everybody who buys our water from us will never try to get more, or someone that we don't even know about yet won't try to get more. We're just going to build a pipeline, move the water, 22,000, but it's up to you after that. Well, you damn well better think carefully about whether you want to fight the fight when half of the battle has already been lost, or if you want to fight the fight now. Okay? Because every single instance in this country that we have observed, every time a source of water is made available to a major metropolitan area, the demand for supply increases and increases and increases. All right, now, I guess at this point I say, fill the sandbags, put on the bulletproof vests, grab your swords, no guns, just grab your swords to the battlements. We're going to have another fight if this continues. And we have to remember that we've got 40 years of good success establishing the fact that you can't just pull water out of this valley without there being an adverse consequence to the hydrology of the valley, to the state, and ultimately to the whole system all the way down to El Paso. And we are responsible to our neighbors. Now I'm going to step off a little bit and make one more comment. The last speaker this morning before lunch talked about the fact that the 6 Rio Grande Pueblos have not even initiated an effort to quantify and identify their water supplies, right? Well, the rule of law to date has been that a state from its apportionment must figure out how to serve the demands of its Indian citizens, participants. Colorado has 2 Indian tribes. In 1985, we negotiated a water rights settlement with them. We've lived by every word of it, as have the 2 Ute tribes. I, at that time, said to the 2 tribal chairs, we're you, you're us, you're Coloradans. You are entitled to your water rights. We're going to protect them. We'll ensure that you have them. Well, that hasn't happened in New Mexico for all of the tribes, and it has to happen. But New Mexico is fully using all of its water already. So I want you all to be very careful as you talk about the feel-good things with our dear friends and neighbors to the south, that we always smile and say, we'll help you in any way we can, except we're not going to send you more water. You can, whatever we can do to be helpful, we'll do it, as long as you don't suggest that we change our compact apportionment. We will send you every year exactly what we owe you at the Lobatos gauge. Don't ask us for more, and please don't ask us to change the timing of when we send the water, right? Because you have ditches in this valley that only get 2 weeks if they're lucky, right? You change the timing and you pull water past those ditches during those 2 weeks, you screwed a whole bunch of very successful farmers. So timing to us is as important almost as volume if we want to ensure that as many of our citizens and neighbors can have a water supply as is possible. So be careful of that. That's not part of my talk. And I'm going to stop here in a second because I actually have a whole bunch of topics I'd like to scream at you about, but I will let you go because I know we've run long. So thank you all very much.